Jaden Carter, an 11-year-old boy with a presence far larger than his slight frame, stepped onto the jet bridge of Flight 743 from New York's JFK to Los Angeles with the kind of quiet confidence that came from a life shaped by privilege and purpose. At just under 4 feet tall, his neatly braided hair framed a face that held sharp, observant eyes, the kind that missed nothing. His outfit, a tailored navy blazer, crisp white shirt, and slim-fit khakis, whispered wealth, though only those with an eye for detail would recognize the subtle logo of a bespoke designer favored by global elites. Around his wrist gleamed a custom watch, a gift from a tech mogul at a gala in Dubai, its understated elegance lost on most, but a clear marker of his extraordinary life. Jaden was no stranger to first class. This was his 12th flight in the premium cabin that year, a routine part of shuttling between his boarding school in London, his father's corporate headquarters in Silicon Valley, and their family estates in Miami and Cape Town. For Jaden, flying first class wasn't a luxury, it was just another Tuesday. His father, Michael Carter, was a titan of industry, a black billionaire whose tech and aviation empire, Carter Global Enterprises, was valued at over $15 billion. Michael's name graced the covers of Forbes and Time, his influence stretching across continents from airline fleets to cutting-edge AI startups. But to the casual observer, Jaden was just a young black boy. And that was precisely how Richard Bennett, the man sprawled across seat 1A, saw him. As Jaden approached the first-class cabin, his eyes scanned the rows with the precision of someone accustomed to navigating high-stakes environments. The cabin was a mix of polished luxury and subtle tension, with passengers settling in, some sipping champagne, others engrossed in laptops or magazines. Jaden's boarding pass, crisp and embossed with the airline's gold logo, clearly marked Seat 1A, the window seat he'd chosen for its view of the clouds, a small ritual he cherished on every flight. But when he reached row 1, he stopped short. A middle-aged white man, in an expensive but slightly rumpled suit, had claimed 1A, his legs stretched out, as if the entire aircraft belonged to him. His graying hair was slicked back, his face buried in his phone fingers, tapping with the kind of aggressive focus that suggested he was used to getting his way. A half-empty glass of scotch sat on the armrest, condensation pooling on the leather. Jaden's first instinct was to assume a mistake. After all, mix-ups happened. He cleared his throat softly, his voice carrying the polished cadence of someone educated at the world's finest schools. "Excuse me, sir," he said, holding out his boarding pass with a steady hand. "I believe you're in my seat. This is 1A, and my ticket has my name on it. Jaden Carter." The man, Richard Bennett, didn't even look up from his phone. His lips curled into a dismissive smirk, as if Jaden's words were an annoyance rather than a legitimate claim. "No, kid," he muttered, his tone dripping with condescension. "You're mistaken. This is my seat. Economy's back there." He waved a hand toward the rear of the plane, his eyes still glued to his screen, as if Jaden were a minor inconvenience, like a waiter who'd brought the wrong order. The words landed like a slap, sharp and deliberate. Their implication clear: a black boy, no matter how well dressed, didn't belong in first class. The cabin, though quiet, seemed to hold its breath. A woman in a tailored suit across the aisle glanced up from her tablet, her brow furrowing. A young couple in row 2 paused their conversation, their eyes flicking toward Jaden. A businessman in row 3 adjusted his glasses, sensing the stir of something uncomfortable. Jaden felt the familiar sting of assumption, a sensation he'd encountered before at elite events, where staff mistook him for a server's child, or in boardrooms where executives underestimated his father based on the color of his skin. But he'd been taught to channel that sting into composure, not anger. His father's voice echoed in his mind. "Never let their ignorance control your response." Sir Jaden said, his voice steady but firm, holding the boarding pass closer. "This is my ticket for seat 1A. Could you please check your boarding pass and move to your assigned seat?" The clarity of his words, delivered with the precision of someone far older, made several passengers take notice. The woman across the aisle leaned forward slightly, her expression shifting from curiosity to concern. But Bennett's reaction was anything but reasonable. He finally looked up, his eyes narrowing as they took in Black, and standing with a confidence that seemed to irritate him. Without even glancing at the boarding pass, he chuckled a low, mocking sound that carried through the cabin. "Listen, little boy," he said, his voice loud enough to draw more eyes. "I don't know what game you're playing, but kids don't just wander into first class. Your parents are probably back in coach, wondering where you ran off to. Go find them before you get in trouble." The condescension was palpable, each word laced with the assumption that Jaden's presence in first class was an error, a fluke, or worse, an act of audacity. The cabin's atmosphere shifted. The young couple exchanged glances, the woman whispering something to her partner, who pulled out his phone, subtly angling it toward the scene. The businessman in row 3 shook his head, his lips tightening in disapproval. A black woman in row 4, dressed in a sharp blazer, set down her coffee with a deliberate clink, her eyes locking onto Bennett with a mix of anger and recognition. Jaden stood his ground, his boarding pass still extended, his expression unshaken. He'd faced this kind of prejudice before, people who looked at him and saw only stereotypes, not the son of a man who could buy the airline they were sitting on. "Sir," he said, his voice now carrying a quiet edge, "I'm not confused. This is my seat, and I have the ticket to prove it. If you'd just look at my boarding pass, we can clear this up." But Bennett wasn't interested in clarity. He leaned back in the seat, crossing his arms with a smug grin. "Sweetheart," he said, the word dripping with mockery, "I've been flying first class longer than you've been alive. I paid for this seat, and I'm not moving for some kid who thinks he can sneak up here. Run along now." The word "sweetheart" hit the cabin like a spark on dry tinder. The woman across the aisle gasped audibly, her hand flying to her mouth. The young couple's whispers grew more urgent, the man now openly recording his phone, capturing Bennett's every word. The black woman in row 4 stood up, her voice sharp but controlled. "Excuse me, but did you just call that boy sweetheart and tell him to run along? You haven't even looked at his ticket." Bennett turned to her, his smirk fading into a scowl. "Ma'am, this doesn't concern you," he snapped. "I'm handling a situation with a kid who's clearly in the wrong section." The racial undertones were unmistakable, now his words implying that Jaden's presence in first class was not just a mistake, but an affront to some unspoken order. The cabin was no longer quiet. Murmurs rippled through the rows, some passengers shifting uncomfortably, others leaning in, sensing a confrontation that would define the flight. Jaden's heart raced, but his face remained a mask of calm. He'd been in rooms with world leaders, sat at tables where billion-dollar deals were made, and learned from his father how to navigate prejudice with dignity. "Sir," he said, his voice cutting through the growing tension, "I'm going to ask you one last time to look at my boarding pass and move to your correct seat. I don't want to escalate this, but I will if I have to." The words were polite, but carried a weight that made Bennett pause, if only for a moment. For the first time, he seemed to sense that something about this boy wasn't what he'd assumed. But his pride, or perhaps his prejudice, wouldn't let him back down. He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. "Escalate. You listen, kid, you don't belong up here. Maybe you got a ticket by mistake, or maybe someone's playing a prank. But this is my seat, and I'm not going anywhere. Go back to where you belong, probably near the back by the bathrooms." The comment about the bathrooms was a gut punch, a deliberate echo of historical segregation that made several passengers recoil. The woman across the aisle stood up now, her voice trembling with indignation. "That's enough. You're out of line, sir. Check his ticket and stop making assumptions." The businessman in row 3 nodded in agreement, muttering, "Unbelievable." The black woman in row 4 took a step into the aisle, her presence commanding. "You're not just rude. You're crossing a line that's going to get you in serious trouble," she said, her eyes burning with the kind of anger born from personal experience. But Bennett doubled down, his voice rising to match the growing hostility. "I don't need a lecture from any of you," he snapped, pointing a finger at the woman. "This is first class, and I'm not letting some kid with no business being here ruin my flight. He doesn't belong, and you all know it." The cabin erupted into a low roar of reactions, gasps, murmurs, and a few sharp retorts. The young couple's video was now joined by others, phones held high to capture the escalating drama. Jaden, still standing in the aisle, felt the weight of every eye on him, some sympathetic, some skeptical, and a few he knew silently agreeing with Bennett's assumptions. But he'd been raised for moments like this. His father had taught him that prejudice was a weapon of the ignorant, and the best defense was not to shout, but to act. He reached into his pocket, pulling out a sleek custom smartphone, a device so exclusive it was unrecognizable to most, its encryption and direct lines to global powerhouses, a testament to his family's influence. "Fine," he said, his voice calm but carrying a new steel. "If you won't resolve this, I'll let someone else handle it." He pressed a single button, speed-dialing a number that connected him to one of the most powerful men in the world. The phone rang once before a deep, authoritative voice answered. "Jaden, what's wrong?" The voice was Michael Carter's, and even through the phone, its weight silenced the cabin. Passengers leaned forward, straining to hear. Bennett, still oblivious to the storm he'd unleashed, rolled his eyes. "Oh, great, calling Daddy to cry about it." "Typical," he sneered, loud enough for everyone to hear. The woman across the aisle shook her head in disgust, whispering to her neighbor, "He has no idea what he's done." Jaden ignored Bennett, speaking clearly into the phone. "Dad, I'm on flight 743 to LA, and there's a man in my seat 1A. He won't check my boarding pass, and he's saying things, racist things, about me not belonging in first class." The flight attendant isn't helping either. There was a pause, and then Michael's voice came through, colder and sharper than before. "Put me on speaker, son. Let's see who thinks they can treat my boy like this." Jaden pressed a button, and Michael Carter's voice filled the cabin, its authority undeniable. "This is Michael Carter, CEO of Carter Global Enterprises. I want to know exactly who's sitting in my son's seat and why they think they can disrespect him." The name dropped like a bomb. Passengers gasped, recognizing the billionaire whose companies owned airlines, hotels, and tech giants. The businessman in row 3 dropped his pen, his eyes wide. The black woman in row 4 smiled faintly, as if she'd known all along that this was no ordinary boy. Bennett's smirk vanished, replaced by a flicker of unease, though he still clung to his arrogance. "Mr. Carter," he said, his voice faltering, but trying to sound confident. "I'm Richard Bennett, and there's just a mix-up here. I'm sure your son is mistaken about the seat." Michael's laugh was icy, cutting through the cabin like a blade. "A mix-up. My son showed you his boarding pass, and you refused to look at it. You told him he belongs by the bathrooms. You want to explain to me and everyone listening why you think a black boy doesn't belong in first class?" The question hung in the air unanswered as the cabin waited for what would happen next. Jaden stood tall, his eyes locked on Bennett, who was beginning to realize he'd made a catastrophic mistake. The flight attendant, Sarah Collins, appeared at the edge of the aisle. her face pale, as she sensed the situation spiraling beyond her control. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came. The young couple's video was still rolling, capturing every second of a moment that was about to change lives. Jaden's composure, his father's voice, and the growing outrage of the passengers had turned a simple seating dispute into a reckoning, one that would expose prejudice in the starkest way possible. And as the plane sat on the tarmac, the engines humming softly, everyone knew that this flight was about to take a very different course. The first-class cabin of Flight 743 was a pressure cooker, the air thick with tension as Michael Carter's voice, icy and commanding, echoed through Jaden's phone, now on speaker for the entire cabin to hear. The words, "Who thinks they can treat my boy like this?" hung like a guillotine over Richard Bennett. The white businessman sprawled in seat 1A, Jaden's rightful place. Bennett's earlier arrogance, a smug certainty that a young black boy couldn't possibly belong in first class, had begun to crack his face paling as he realized the name Michael Carter wasn't just a random parent, but a billionaire whose empire could crush careers with a single call. Yet his pride, fueled by years of unchecked entitlement, refused to let him back down completely. Jaden stood in the aisle, his 11-year-old frame radiating a calm that belied the storm brewing around him. His custom smartphone, a sleek device with encrypted lines to global powerhouses, was still pressed to his ear, though his father's voice now filled the cabin, demanding answers. The passengers, a mix of business elites, vacationers, and curious onlookers, were no longer passive spectators. Phones were out recording every word, every gesture, as the confrontation escalated into a public spectacle of prejudice and power. Bennett shifted uncomfortably in the stolen seat, his expensive suit now clinging to him, with the sweat of a man who sensed trouble but couldn't quite grasp its magnitude. He forced a chuckle, though it sounded hollow, more nervous than defiant. "Mr. Carter," he said, his voice loud enough to carry but lacking its earlier venom. "This is just a misunderstanding. Your son seems confused about his seat, and I was just trying to maintain order up here. First class is, well, you know, for certain kinds of passengers." The words "certain kinds" landed like a match in gasoline, their racial undertones unmistakable. Several passengers gasped audibly, the sound rippling through the cabin like a wave. The black woman in row 4, whose sharp blazer and commanding presence marked her as someone accustomed to authority, stood up again, her eyes blazing. "Certain kinds," she repeated, her voice cutting through the murmurs. "You mean black kids don't qualify? You haven't even looked at his boarding pass, and you're sitting there acting like you own this plane." Her words were met with nods from a few passengers, while others shifted uncomfortably, unsure whether to intervene or stay silent. The woman across the aisle, who had gasped earlier, now leaned forward, her tablet forgotten on her lap. "This is outrageous," she said, her voice trembling with indignation. "That boy showed you his ticket, and you're treating him like he snuck in here. Check his boarding pass and stop this nonsense." Her words emboldened others. A young couple in row 2, who had been whispering earlier, now spoke up, the woman's voice sharp. "You're making this about race, and it's disgusting," she said, her phone still recording, capturing Bennett's every flinch. Her partner nodded, zooming in on the scene, knowing this footage would be viral within hours. But not everyone was on Jaden's side. A middle-aged man in a polo shirt, seated in row 5, muttered under his breath, "Maybe the kid is in the wrong section. First class isn't for everyone." His words, though quiet, were overheard by the black woman in row 4, who shot him a look that could have melted steel. "Say that louder," she challenged, her voice, daring him to repeat his prejudice in front of the cabin. He shrank back suddenly, engrossed in his magazine, but the divide was clear. Some passengers saw Jaden as a victim of injustice, while others, consciously or not, shared Bennett's assumption that a black boy didn't belong. Jaden, still standing in the aisle, held his boarding pass aloft, its gold-embossed print catching the cabin's soft lighting. His face was a study in composure, his eyes locked on Bennett, who was now squirming under the weight of Michael Carter's voice, and the passengers' growing outrage. Sir Jaden said, his voice steady, but carrying a new edge. "You keep saying I'm confused, but you haven't looked at my ticket. It says Seat 1A, my name, Jaden Carter, right here. Why won't you check it? Or show me yours?" The question was simple, logical, and devastating, exposing Bennett's refusal to engage with facts. The cabin fell silent, waiting for his response. Bennett's eyes darted around, seeking an ally, but found none. The flight attendant, Sarah Collins, finally appeared, her face a mask of forced professionalism. She was in her late 30s with the polished look of someone who'd spent years managing passenger disputes, but her hesitation suggested she'd already made up her mind about who belonged in this confrontation. "Excuse me, Sarah," said her tone overly polite, directed at Jaden. "Can I see your boarding pass, young man?" The request wasn't unreasonable, but the way she asked, addressing only Jaden, ignoring Bennett's refusal to produce his own ticket, revealed her bias. She took the boarding pass from Jaden's hand, examining it with a scrutiny that bordered on suspicion, as if expecting to find a forgery. The pass was pristine, clearly legitimate, with Jaden Carter Seat 1A First Class printed in bold. She frowned, her lips tightening, clearly uncomfortable with what she saw. "This does show Seat 1A, she admitted reluctantly, her voice barely audible. "But there seems to be some confusion here." "Sir?" She turned to Bennett, her tone softening, almost deferential. "Could you please show me your boarding pass so we can sort this out?" Bennett waved her off, his arrogance flaring despite the growing pressure. "I don't need to show you anything," he snapped. "I've been flying first class for 20 years. This kid doesn't belong here, and you know it. Just handle it." The word handle was a mistake, a command that exposed his expectation that the airline would side with him over a black child. Sarah hesitated, her eyes flicking between Jaden and Bennett, her bias laid bare. Instead of insisting on Bennett's ticket or enforcing airline policy, she turned back to Jaden. "Maybe we can find you another seat in first class," she suggested, her voice patronizing, as if Jaden were the problem to be solved. The suggestion was absurd. Jaden had paid for 1A, had the ticket to prove it, and was being asked to compromise because a grown man refused to follow rules. The black woman in row 4 wasn't having it. "Are you serious?" she said, stepping fully into the aisle now, her voice ringing with authority. "This boy has a valid ticket, and that man won't even show his. Why are you asking him to move? This is discrimination, plain and simple." Her words ignited the cabin, drawing cheers from a few passengers and uncomfortable shifts from others. The young couple's video was now joined by at least 3 other phones. The red recording lights a silent promise that this moment would live far beyond the tarmac. Bennett, sensing the tide turning, decided to double down, his voice rising to drown out the protests. "Look," he said, standing up now, towering over Jaden, "in a clear attempt to intimidate you, people always think you can just take what you want. This is first class, not a charity flight. You don't belong here, and I'm not moving for some kid who probably got that ticket from his daddy's handouts." The phrase, "you people," was a grenade, its racist implications exploding across the cabin. The woman across the aisle stood up, her face flushed with anger. "How dare you!" she shouted. "You're sitting in his seat, making racist comments, and now you're insulting his family. Show your ticket or get out." The businessman in row 3, who had been quiet until now, added his voice. "This is unacceptable," he said, his tone measured but firm. "Check the man's ticket, or call security. This needs to stop." Even the young man in the polo shirt, who had muttered earlier, looked uneasy, now his prejudice wavering in the face of Bennett's blatant racism. Jaden, still holding his phone, felt the familiar burn of anger in his chest, but he channeled it into the icy calm his father had taught him. He'd heard you people before at galas, where waiters assumed he was a guest's tag-along in boardrooms, where executives underestimated his father's genius. But he'd also seen how his father turned that prejudice into fuel building an empire that silenced doubters. Sir Jaden said, his voice cutting through the chaos with precision, "You're making a lot of assumptions about me, but you still haven't shown your ticket. If you don't have one for 1A, you're the one who doesn't belong here." The words were a quiet challenge delivered with the confidence of someone who knew the power backing him. Bennett's face twisted with fury, his prejudice blinding him to the danger he was in. "You little—" he began, but was cut off by Michael Carter's voice booming through the phone's speaker, now louder, sharper, and utterly unyielding. "Enough!" Michael roared the single word, silencing the cabin. Passengers froze, phones still recording, as the billionaire's voice took command. "Richard Bennett, is it? You've just made the biggest mistake of your life. You didn't just steal my son's seat. You insulted him, discriminated against him, and created a hostile environment on a flight I could buy 10 times over. And you," his voice shifted, addressing Sarah, "you're the flight attendant who's supposed to protect passengers, yet you're siding with a man who won't even show his ticket. I want to speak to the captain. Now." The mention of the captain sent a jolt through the cabin. Sarah's face drained of color, her hands trembling as she realized the gravity of her misstep. She fumbled for her intercom, her voice shaking as she called for the captain. "Captain Reynolds, we have a situation in first class," she said, her tone betraying her panic. The passengers were riveted, sensing that this was no ordinary dispute. The black woman in row 4 nodded approvingly, whispering to her neighbor, "This man's about to learn a lesson he'll never forget." Bennett, now visibly sweating, tried to backpedal. "Mr. Carter, I didn't mean any disrespect," he stammered, his earlier bravado crumbling. "I just thought there was a mistake. I'm sure we can work this out." But Michael wasn't interested in excuses. "You thought a black boy couldn't possibly belong in first class?" he said, his voice cold and precise. "You thought you could bully him out of his seat because of his skin and his age. You didn't think at all, Mr. Bennett, and that's why you're about to face consequences you can't imagine." The cabin was electric, with anticipation, every passenger hanging on Michael's words. The young couple's video was now streaming live on social media, the comments flooding in with hashtags like #JusticeForJaden and #EndRacism. The businessman in row 3 was typing furiously on his laptop, likely drafting an email to his network about the incident. Even the man in the polo shirt was silent now, his earlier muttering replaced by a look of unease, as if he realized he'd been on the wrong side of history. Sarah, desperate to salvage her authority, tried to intervene. "Mr. Carter, I assure you, we're handling this," she said, her voice weak. "We'll find a solution that works for everyone." The words were a misstep, revealing her bias once again. The black woman in row 4 shook her head, her voice sharp. "A solution? You're asking a child to compromise because a grown man is racist. Do your job and remove him." Her words were met with a chorus of agreement from several passengers, their voices rising in support of Jaden. The woman across the aisle added, "This is your airline's failure. You let this man create a hostile environment, and now you're blaming the victim?" Sarah's face crumpled, her professional facade cracking under the weight of the cabin's judgment. She looked to Bennett, perhaps hoping he'd produce a ticket and defuse the situation, but he remained defiant, clutching his phone as if it could save him. Jaden, still standing, looked around the cabin, taking in the faces of the passengers, some outraged, some uncomfortable, a few still skeptical. He knew this moment wasn't just about him. It was about every person who'd ever been told they didn't belong because of their skin or their youth. His father's voice returned, addressing the captain directly now. "Captain Reynolds, this is Michael Carter. I want this aircraft stopped immediately and returned to the gate. There's a passenger in my son's seat who's making racist comments, and a flight attendant who's failing to protect him. I want them both removed before this plane moves another inch." The cabin erupted in gasps and murmurs. The reality sinking in, a billionaire was grounding a flight because of his son's mistreatment. The young couple's live stream spiked with viewers, the comments exploding with support. Bennett's face was now ashen, his hands shaking as he realized the scale of his error. Sarah, too, looked like she might faint, her career flashing before her eyes. The captain's voice came over the intercom, calm, but tinged with urgency. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're returning to the gate due to a passenger conduct issue. We apologize for the inconvenience and will resolve this promptly." The plane's engines shifted the aircraft, slowing as it veered back toward the terminal. Passengers exchanged glances, some whispering in awe, others nodding in approval. The black woman in row 4 gave Jaden a small, proud smile, as if to say, "You've got this." Jaden met her gaze, nodding slightly, his composure unbroken. He knew what was coming. His father didn't make idle threats. Bennett, now slumped in the stolen seat, was beginning to understand that he'd picked the wrong target for his prejudice. The phones kept recording. The cabin buzzed with anticipation, and Jaden stood tall, his father's voice still echoing in his ears as the plane rolled back to the gate where consequences were waiting to board. The first-class cabin of Flight 743 was a theater of stunned silence as the plane rolled back to the gate, its engines humming softly, a stark contrast to the explosive tension that had erupted moments earlier. Michael Carter's voice, still resonating through Jaden's phone on speaker, had just issued a command that stopped an entire flight return to the gate and remove Richard Bennett, the white businessman who had stolen Jaden's seat and hurled racist insults, along with Sarah Collins, the flight attendant who had sided with him. Jaden Carter, the 11-year-old heir to a $15 billion empire, stood in the aisle, his slight frame radiating a quiet strength that commanded the attention of every passenger. His custom smartphone, its sleek design, a subtle marker of his family's influence, was still in his hand. The line opened to his father, Michael Carter, whose authority had turned a seating dispute into a public reckoning. The cabin was alive with the glow of phone screens, passengers recording and live streaming the unfolding drama, their videos already amassing thousands of views on social media with hashtags like #Justice for Jaden and #Racism on Flight 743. The air was thick with anticipation, every eye on Jaden Bennett and the approaching sound of footsteps on the jet bridge. Richard Bennett, still occupying seat 1A, was a shadow of the arrogant man who had dismissed Jaden as a kid who didn't belong in first class. His expensive suit was now damp with sweat, his graying hair disheveled, his hands clutching the armrests as if they could anchor him against the storm he'd unleashed. His earlier smirk had vanished, replaced by a look of dawning terror, as Michael Carter's words echoed in his mind, "You've just made the biggest mistake of your life." Bennett's eyes darted around the cabin, seeking an escape or an ally, but found only judgment. The black woman in row 4, whose commanding presence had challenged him earlier, stared with a mix of disgust and satisfaction. The woman across the aisle, who had stood up for Jaden, was still on her feet, Her arms crossed her phone, recording every second. The young couple in row 2, their live stream now viral, whispered excitedly, knowing they were capturing a moment that would dominate news cycles. Even the man in the polo shirt, who had muttered skeptically earlier, now avoided eye contact, his prejudice exposed by the clarity of Bennett's racism. Sarah Collins, the flight attendant, stood frozen at the edge of the aisle. Her professional composure shattered. Her face was pale, her hands trembling as she clutched her clipboard, realizing that her decision to side with Bennett had placed her career in jeopardy. She had asked Jaden for his boarding pass while ignoring Bennett's refusal to show his a choice that now looked like blatant bias in front of a cabin full of witnesses. "Mr. Carter," she stammered, her voice barely audible, "I assure you this was a misunderstanding. I was just trying to keep the peace." But Michael's voice cut through her excuse like a blade. "Keep the peace," he said, his tone arctic. "You threatened to remove my son from a flight because he demanded his rightful seat. You let a man who won't show his ticket make racist comments while you stood by. That's not keeping the peace, that's enabling discrimination." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow, her eyes darting to the passengers, some of whom nodded in agreement, their phones capturing her every reaction. The black woman in row 4 shook her head, muttering, "You had one job and you chose wrong." The captain's voice came over the intercom again, steady but tinged with urgency. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've returned to the gate to address a passenger conduct issue. Please remain seated as we resolve this matter." The plane came to a full stop, and through the windows, passengers could see airport security vehicles pulling up, their flashing lights casting an ominous glow. The sound of footsteps grew louder, and the cabin door opened to reveal a team of officials, airport security officers, 2 FBI agents in dark suits, and a woman in a sharp blazer who introduced herself as Elizabeth Harper, Vice President of Customer Experience for the airline. Her expression was grim, her eyes scanning the cabin as if assessing the scale of the public relations disaster unfolding before her. Behind her, a man in a pilot's uniform, Captain Reynolds himself, followed his presence, signaling the seriousness of the situation. The passengers fell silent, their phones still recording, knowing they were witnessing something unprecedented. Officer Rodriguez, the lead security officer, a tall man with a no-nonsense demeanor, stepped into the first-class cabin. His badge gleamed under the cabin lights, and his voice was calm but authoritative. "Mr. Richard Bennett," he said, his eyes locking onto the businessman, "I need you to gather your belongings and come with us immediately." Bennett's face crumpled, his hands shaking as he fumbled with his phone and briefcase. "Officer, this is a mistake," he said, his voice high and desperate. "I was just trying to maintain order. The kid didn't belong here, and I thought—" The FBI agent, a woman with a sharp gaze, interrupted. "Mr. Bennett, we have multiple videos showing you refusing to check the boy's boarding pass, making racially charged comments and creating a hostile environment. You're facing potential federal charges for violating civil rights laws in a public accommodation. I suggest you comply now." The words "federal charges" sent a shiver through the cabin. Passengers exchanged glances, some whispering in shock, others nodding in approval. The young couple's live stream spiked with comments. "He's done for, and justice is coming." Bennett tried one last defense, his voice rising with panic. "I didn't know who he was. If I'd known he was your son, Mr. Carter, I'd have." Michael's voice boomed through the phone, cutting him off. "You'd have what treated him with respect because you knew his father could ruin you. You didn't care about his ticket or his rights. You saw a black boy and decided he didn't belong. That's not a mistake, Mr. Bennett. That's racism, and it's on video for the world to see." The cabin erupted in murmurs, the weight of Michael's words sinking in. The black woman in row 4 clapped slowly, her applause a quiet rebuke. The woman across the aisle nodded, her phone still recording, as she whispered to her neighbor, "He's going to regret this for the rest of his life." Even the man in the polo shirt who had doubted Jaden earlier looked down, his face flushed with shame. Elizabeth Harper, the airline executive, stepped forward, her voice steady but laced with urgency. "On behalf of the airline, I want to apologize to Mr. Jaden Carter and every passenger who witnessed this unacceptable behavior," she said, addressing the cabin. "This incident does not reflect our values, and we are taking immediate action to address it." She turned to Sarah, her expression hardening. "Ms. Collins, you failed to enforce airline policy and allowed a passenger to be discriminated against. Your actions are under review, and you will accompany security off the aircraft." Sarah's face collapsed, tears welling in her eyes, as she realized her career was unraveling. "Ms. Harper, please," she pleaded. "I was just trying to de-escalate. I didn't mean—" But Harper cut her off. "You threatened a child with removal while ignoring the aggressor's refusal to show his ticket. Your bias is documented, Ms. Collins, and it's unacceptable." The words were final, and Sarah's shoulders slumped as she gathered her belongings, her professional facade shattered. The FBI agent turned to Bennett, her voice firm. "Mr. Bennett, you're being removed from this flight for creating a hostile environment and violating federal regulations. Any further resistance will result in immediate arrest." Bennett, now trembling, stood up from seat 1A, his briefcase slipping from his hands and spilling papers across the floor. The passengers watched in stunned silence as he was escorted down the aisle, flanked by 2 security officers. His earlier arrogance was gone, replaced by the hunched posture of a man who knew his life was about to change forever. Sarah followed, her head bowed, her clipboard clutched tightly, as if it could shield her from the consequences of her actions. The young couple's live stream captured every step of their walk of shame, the comments flooding with support for Jaden and condemnation for Bennett and Sarah. The black woman in row 4 gave Jaden a nod, her eyes shining with pride. "You handled that like a king, young man," she said, her voice carrying across the cabin. Other passengers murmured in agreement, some even clapping softly as the officials disappeared down the jet bridge. Jaden, still standing, finally moved to seat 1A, settling into the leather chair that was rightfully his. He placed his boarding pass on the armrest, its gold print a quiet testament to his victory. The cabin was still buzzing, passengers whispering about what they'd just witnessed. The woman across the aisle leaned over, her voice soft but earnest. "I'm so sorry you had to go through that," she said. "You were incredible." Jaden gave her a small smile, his composure unbroken. "Thank you," he said simply, his voice steady. On the phone, Michael's voice returned, softer now, but still commanding. "Jaden, I'm proud of you, son. You stood your ground with dignity, and you showed them who you are. Now, Captain Reynolds, I trust you'll ensure my son's comfort for the rest of this flight." The captain, standing at the front of the cabin, nodded. "Absolutely, Mr. Carter. We'll be departing shortly, and I'll personally ensure Mr. Jaden is taken care of." The passengers erupted in spontaneous applause, not just for Jaden, but for the swift justice that had unfolded before their eyes. As the officials left and the cabin door closed, the atmosphere shifted from tension to awe. The videos were already spreading across social media, with news outlets picking up the story. Billionaire's son faced racism on flight grounds plane. In response, Jaden sat calmly looking out the window at the tarmac, where security vehicles were driving away with Bennett and Sarah. He knew this wasn't just about him, it was about every person who'd ever been told they didn't belong because of their skin, their age, or their appearance. His father's voice came through one last time before he hung up. "This isn't over, Jaden," he said. "We're going to make sure this never happens to anyone else." Jaden nodded, his eyes fixed on the horizon, knowing that the consequences of this moment would ripple far beyond the flight. The plane's engines roared back to life, preparing for takeoff. But the real journey, the one of justice and accountability, had only just begun. The first-class cabin of Flight 743 hummed with a quiet energy as the plane taxied back to the runway, its engines roaring to life after the dramatic halt at the gate. Jaden Carter, the 11-year-old heir to Carter Global Enterprises, sat calmly in his rightful seat, 1A. The leather chair still warm from Richard Bennett's brief, ill-fated occupation. The cabin was no longer a battleground, but a space transformed by what had just unfolded, a public reckoning of prejudice that had left every passenger re-evaluating their assumptions. Jaden's custom smartphone rested on the armrest, its screen dark now that his father, Michael Carter, had hung up his final words, still echoing in Jaden's mind. "We're going to make sure this never happens to anyone else." The passengers, their phones still glowing from recording the incident, were a mix of awe and reflection, their whispers a soft undercurrent to the plane's ascent. The videos of Richard Bennett's racist tirade and Sarah Collins's biased inaction were already viral, flooding social media with millions of views and hashtags like #JusticeForJaden and #NoRoomForRacism. But for Jaden, this moment was more than a viral spectacle. It was a chance to show the world what dignity under fire looked like, and to plant a seed for change. The cabin lights dimmed as the plane climbed into the sky, the New York skyline fading into a patchwork of clouds. Jaden looked out the window, his sharp eyes catching the glint of sunlight on the horizon, a view he'd chosen seat 1A4. The passengers around him were settling back into their routines, but their glances lingered on him, some with admiration, others with curiosity, and a few with the quiet shame of those who'd stayed silent during the confrontation. The black woman in row 4, whose commanding presence had bolstered Jaden's stand, leaned across the aisle, her voice warm but firm. "You did good, young man," she said, her eyes shining with pride. "Not many could have handled that the way you did. You're going to change things." Jaden gave her a small nod, his lips curving into a modest smile. "Thank you, ma'am," he said, his voice steady, carrying the polished cadence of someone who'd grown up in boardrooms and diplomatic dinners. "I just wanted my seat back and for people to see what's right." Her smile widened, and she settled back, her own phone buzzing with notifications as her video of the incident racked up thousands of shares. Across the aisle, the woman who had stood up for Jaden during the confrontation was still visibly shaken, her tablet now closed, as she processed what she'd witnessed. She leaned toward Jaden, her voice low and earnest. "I'm so sorry you had to go through that," she said, her eyes searching his face. "You were incredible, calm, strong, everything. I hope you know you've got people in your corner." Jaden met her gaze, his expression softening. "I appreciate that," he said. "It means a lot to know people spoke up." His words were simple, but they carried a weight that made her nod, her eyes glistening with emotion. The young couple in row 2, whose live stream had captured the entire ordeal, were now scrolling through the flood of comments on their video, reading some aloud in hushed tones. "This kid's a hero," one comment read. "That man's career is over," said another. The businessman in row 3, who had quietly supported Jaden, was typing an email, his fingers moving with purpose, likely alerting his network to the incident, ensuring it wouldn't be swept under the rug. The man in the polo shirt, who had muttered skeptically earlier, sat quietly. Now his magazine untouched, his face a mix of discomfort and reflection. He'd been one of the few who'd doubted Jaden's place in first class. But the swift consequences Bennett and Sarah's removal by security and FBI agents had shaken him. He glanced at Jaden, then quickly looked away, as if afraid to meet the boy's eyes. Jaden noticed, but said nothing, his father's lessons ringing in his mind. Some people learn the hard way, but they learn. The cabin was a microcosm of society, supportive allies, silent bystanders, and those grappling with their own biases, all brought into sharp relief by one boy's refusal to be diminished. As the plane leveled off, a soft chime signaled the captain's voice over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, Captain Reynolds," said his tone professional, but warm. "We're now at cruising altitude en route to Los Angeles. On behalf of the crew, I apologize again for the earlier disruption. We're committed to ensuring a safe and respectful environment for all passengers, especially Mr. Jaden Carter, who handled a difficult situation with remarkable grace." The cabin erupted in soft applause, a few passengers even cheering their voices a chorus of support for the boy in 1A. Jaden's phone buzzed, and he glanced at the screen, a message from his father. "Proud of you, son. We're not done yet. Check the news when you land." Jaden smiled faintly, knowing Michael Carter didn't make idle promises. He tucked the phone into his pocket and turned his attention to a young girl in row 5, no older than 7, who was clutching her mother's arm, her eyes wide with nervous excitement about flying. Jaden recognized the look. He'd been that age once, flying alone for the first time, the world feeling both vast and intimidating. He leaned toward her, his voice gentle. "First time flying?" he asked. The girl nodded shyly, her mother smiling gratefully. "It's a little scary," the girl admitted, her voice barely a whisper. Jaden's smile widened, warm and reassuring. "It's okay to be scared," he said, "but you're on an adventure. Look out the window when we're up high. It's like you're on top of the world." The girl's eyes brightened, and she peeked toward the window, her fear easing. Her mother mouthed a silent thank you to Jaden, who nodded back his small act of kindness, a reminder that strength wasn't just about standing up to bullies, but lifting others up too. As the flight continued, the cabin settled into a quieter rhythm, but the impact of the earlier events lingered. Passengers were scrolling through their phones, reading the breaking news stories that had already picked up the incident. Billionaire's son faces racism on Flight Force's plane to ground. The videos, now viewed by millions, showed Bennett's racist comments and Sarah's biased inaction, with headlines calling for accountability. Social media was ablaze with activists and influencers demanding justice, while others praised Jaden's composure and Michael's swift response. The airline had issued a public statement read aloud by a passenger in row 6. "We deeply regret the incident on Flight 743 and have terminated the employment of the involved crew member. We are cooperating fully with federal authorities and are implementing mandatory anti-bias training across our staff." The statement was a start, but Jaden knew it was only the beginning. His father's empire wasn't just about wealth, it was about influence, and Michael would use it to ensure this wasn't just a fleeting scandal, but a catalyst for change. Jaden's thoughts drifted to the moment he'd called his father, the calm certainty in his voice as he'd stood his ground. He'd learned from Michael that power wasn't about shouting or revenge, it was about action, about making sure prejudice couldn't hide in the shadows. He glanced at the young girl again, now giggling as she looked out her window, and felt a surge of purpose. This wasn't just about him, it was about her, about every kid who might face the same assumptions he had. He pulled out his phone and texted his father. "Dad, what can we do to make sure this doesn't happen to other kids?" The reply came quickly. "We're already on it, Jaden. I'm meeting with airline execs tomorrow to push for new policies. You started this, now we finish it." Jaden's heart swelled, not with pride, but with resolve. He wasn't just the son of a billionaire, he was a boy who'd faced hate and turned it into a moment of truth. The woman in row 4, who had been checking her phone, looked up and caught Jaden's eye. "You know," she said, her voice carrying across the quiet cabin, "what you did back there? That's going to stick with people. You didn't just take your seat. You showed the world what happens when you don't back down." Jaden nodded, his expression serious. "I just want people to be treated right," he said, "no matter who they are or what they look like." His words were simple, but they landed with the weight of a manifesto, earning nods from passengers who overheard. The businessman in row 3 closed his laptop and leaned toward Jaden. "You're going to be someone big one day," he said, his voice gruff but sincere. "Bigger than your dad, maybe." Jaden smiled, shaking his head. "I just want to be someone who makes things better," he said, his voice quiet but firm. As the plane soared over the Midwest, Jaden looked out at the clouds, their soft edges glowing with the late afternoon sun. He thought about Bennett, now facing federal charges, and a ruined reputation his racist assumptions exposed to the world. He thought about Sarah, whose career had ended because she'd chosen bias over duty. And he thought about the girl in row 5, who might grow up in a world where she wouldn't have to prove her worth because of her skin or her age. His father's voice echoed in his mind. This is about every kid who's been told they don't belong. Jaden knew this moment was bigger than one flight, one seat, or one boy. It was about a world where dignity wasn't optional, where prejudice met consequences, and where a kid like him could spark change just by standing his ground. The captain's voice returned, announcing their descent into Los Angeles. "We'll be landing shortly," he said, "and we thank you for your patience. Mr. Jaden Carter, it's been an honor to have you on board." The cabin erupted in applause again, louder this time, a collective acknowledgement of a boy who'd turned a moment of injustice into a lesson for all. Jaden looked out the window, the lights of LA coming into view, and felt a quiet certainty settle in his chest. He'd taken back his seat, but more than that, he'd reclaimed his place in a world that sometimes tried to push him out. And as the plane touched down, he knew this was only the beginning. A spark that would ignite a fire for justice carried forward by a boy who refused to be anything less than who he was.